Ladies and gentlemen, I want to offer a very warm welcome this evening to you. It's a very special occasion for the university as we celebrate the appointment of Professor David Sanders as the first Regius Professor of Political Science in the United Kingdom. And that occurs in the 50th year since the founding of the university, which makes this a doubly special moment for the university. 12 Regius Professorships were announced in 2012 by Her Majesty The Queen, awarded to universities across the United Kingdom to mark her Diamond Jubilee. Prior to these awards, only 2 Regius Professorships had been awarded in the last century, so this really is a prestigious honour of which the university is very proud. Only 2 Regius Professorships were awarded in social sciences, and the University of Essex was the recipient of one of these and is indeed one of the youngest universities to receive the accolade of a Regius Professorship. We're particularly proud of the award because it recognises our equal commitment to excellence in education and excellence in research. We are a university where we expect our leading researchers to contribute to the student experience by embedding research at the heart of the curriculum. And this commitment lies at the very heart of our values and indeed our commitment to offering a transformational educational experience to all of our students. David has been a key figure in the achievements of Essex's Department of Government, which has topped the United Kingdom politics rankings for the quality of its research in every one of the 6 national research assessment exercises. This is an absolutely extraordinary and indeed consistent achievement of excellence over the last 28 years. After studying at Essex as a postgraduate student, Professor Sanders started teaching politics at the university in 1975 and is the author of numerous influential books and articles on British politics, including Lawmaking and Cooperation in International Politics, Losing an Empire, Finding a Role, Political Choice in Britain, Performance Politics and the British Voter, Affluence, Austerity and Electoral Change in Britain, and Political Integration of Ethnic Minorities in Britain. David has also co-edited the top UK political science journal, the British Journal of Political Science, between 1990 and 2008. David is a Fellow of the British Academy and received a Special Recognition Award from the Political Studies Association in 2012 for his commitment to outstanding research, which has shaped public understanding of politics. From 2000 to 2012, he was the principal investigator for the British election study, which is conducted at every general election to study electoral behaviour and how elections contribute to the operation of our democracy. This prestigious study was based at Essex from 1974 to 1983 and again from 2000 to 2012. David has been absolutely integral to establishing our Department of Government as absolutely the best in the United Kingdom. He's played a pivotal role in the development and expansion of the discipline of electoral studies in Britain and Europe. We're delighted to have been able to appoint David as our first Regius Professor in recognition of his sustained and outstanding intellectual contribution to the rigorous understanding of teaching of political science. As you'll find out, David is a very gifted communicator, and many have benefited from David's commitment to teaching, including invited guests and indeed one of our distinguished panelists tonight. We are delighted to be able to welcome as our panel for the event the Right Honourable John Bercow MP, Speaker of the House of Commons and a graduate of the Department of Government, Professor Dame Helen Wallace, FPA, Foreign Secretary of the British Academy and Emeritus Professor at the London School of Economics, Baroness Shirley Williams of Crosby, Essex Honorary Graduate, co-founder of the Social Democratic Party and Professor Emeritus of Elective Politics at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University, and Professor Anthony King, Essex County Council Millennium Professor of British Government at the University of Essex. Part of our 50th anniversary celebrations, this event also launches this year's series of inaugural lectures by our newly appointed professors. Themes explored in this year's series include translating history for television, the role of women in peace and conflict, optimization, the science of getting the best out of our resources, the Afro-Brazilian art form, capoeira, and literature, home and homecoming. Our first lecture will take place at 6 p.m. on Monday, the 1st of December, and will be given by Professor Pam Cox, who will be drawing on her 2 recent BBC series to explore translating history for television. I'd like to take this opportunity to welcome Professor David Sanders, first ever Regius Professor of Political Science in the United Kingdom, and ask David to deliver his inaugural lecture entitled The Reluctant Europeans, Britain and the European Union, 1973 to 2015. David.
Thank you. I hope you'll forgive me for taking my jacket off, but I want to try and get a bit of excitement going, which I can't do in a jacket. Thank you, Vice-Chancellor, for those very kind words. This award that I got really was an award to the Department of Government. I was just the lucky recipient who happened to be in the right place at the right time. Anyway, I want to talk about this theme. I hope the technology works. Yes. 3 themes that I want to talk about that I hope you'll kind of take away from this lecture. The first one is something that probably doesn't surprise you, that the British are distinctively anti-European. I'm going to try and demonstrate that very quickly in the early part of the lecture. The second is a kind of a theme that comes through as you see the data, that a referendum is very risky. I really wish David Cameron had spoken to a few academics before he decided that having a referendum would get him out of his difficulties inside the Conservative Party. And the third theme is that I want to offer some evidence that I think is a challenge both to Eurosceptics and to Europhiles. If you're a Eurosceptic, I hope I can present you with 1 or 2 bits of information that might worry you a bit. And if you're a Europhile, then similarly, I hope that I can convince you that maybe there are some things that do need changing. Here's where we're going. 4 sections to the lecture. The first is just a graph, really, about the long-term pattern of support. And this is a graph that you'll find very interesting. I did wonder about making the whole lecture about this particular graph, because it really does tell the story of what's been going on. But I thought I ought to provide you with a few more other things as well. The second, to look at some evidence, not just about popular opinion in Britain, but about elite opinion. There aren't very many studies of elite opinion, systematic studies. And I was lucky enough to be involved in one with a group of scholars from around Europe. And I just want to present you with a little bit of evidence on that. Then getting on to a third question, which we'll also whiz through quite quickly, which is about different segments of the British electorate. Are there different groups of people that are more Eurosceptic, less Eurosceptic, and so on, and why might that be the case? And then finally, I want to get on to what really I consider to be the most important part of the lecture, which is the explanatory part. Why are the British the way they are? Why are they so Eurosceptic? And when I prepared this lecture the first time round, I was having to make some of it up. Political scientists do this from time to time. They have to pretend that they have evidence, and they have to be very assertive and very positive in the way that they state things, in the hope that you'll be convinced, even though there's no real evidence to support it. I was very, very lucky that my son happens to work for YouGov, and I was able to persuade him in the last 3 weeks to insert some questions in one of the surveys that he was already doing that related to some of these putative explanations that I was offering. And to my amazement, actually, it turned out that most of these explanations had some empirical backing. It wasn't just a matter of me making up stories. So you'll see where this comes in later on. So that's where we're going. Okay, here's the graph. Now, this graph is taken from some work done by an American political scientist called Chris Anderson at Cornell. And he, with one of his students, spent a long time doing a really serious analysis of a lot of data from a whole range of different sources over the period that you see on the graph there. From 1952, maybe some of you at the back can't see that, but that's where the bottom axis begins, 1952, and it runs through to 2008. They tried to measure what the support for the European Union, European unification was over time. And what I've done is I've plotted, they've done this for a range of countries, but I've combined the 5 big original members of the 6 of the EEC 6, and that's the blue line that you see, and the sort of reddy brown line is Britain. Now you'll see when you look at the left-hand side of the graph in the early 1950s, there's almost as much support for European unification in Britain as there was in the other European countries. Well, of course, at that time, we weren't part of it. We didn't want to be part of the European coal and steel community in 1952, so we were quite happy for the other Europeans to get together and have some kind of unified approach to, in that case, particular industries. What you see then happening is it starts to diverge. And you see the thing moving together over time. Now, this is rather important. If you look at those 2 graphs, you'll see that as things develop over time, the rise and fall in the 2 graphs looks fairly similar, even though the blue graph is always a lot higher than the red graph, because there's always a lot more support for European unification in the rest of Europe than there is in the UK. Now, I've marked some of the points where those turning points seem to happen, but that's perhaps less important than the overall message that's coming out of this. What it's saying is that support for the European Union, European unification in Britain, is driven by forces that are probably outside the UK. They're driven by the same forces that are driving movements in support in the rest of Europe. And this is what makes it so risky. This is the first point where we see a risk for David Cameron, that he thinks we can have a referendum where we'll have deliberation internally. But it may well be that it's big things happening out in the real world, in the world outside the UK, that might be driving patterns of support. So that's the background, that's the overall pattern of support. At the moment, if you look to the opinion polls, and I'll be saying a little bit more about the period since 2008 as we go on, if you look at the opinion polls at the moment, opinion's pretty much divided evenly. If you ask people whether they approve, disapprove of the EU, it's more or less 50-50. There's really not that much in it. But what I'm going to do is present you very quickly with a little bit of evidence where the same questions have been asked of elites in Europe and also of mass publics in Europe in order to see how Britain relates to other countries in terms of elite opinion and mass opinion. And with these surveys that you've been able to read about there while I've been talking, conducted in 2007, 2009, fairly large samples, representative samples in 16 countries, and then trying to get also at elite opinion by having groups of scholars who went to interview members of the elites, business elites, and also political elites in the various countries. And as you'll see, what the results show is that we are different. We are the most Eurosceptic at both elite and mass level of all of the European countries. And that's what this next slide begins to show. I'm only going to show you 2 slides like this. I'm sure you'll be pleased to know I've got hundreds like this that kind of reinforce the broad conclusion. The red lines are elite support in a country, and the blue lines are mass support in a country. Now, again, you may not be able to see exactly what's written along the bottom line, but it's the different countries where we did these surveys. And you'll see if you look to the middle, I'll just see if I can get this red thing to work. See there, that's Britain. And if you look up that line, you'll see our elite and our mass opinion is fairly well aligned. We're fairly similar in terms of both the elites in Britain are similar to the masses in Britain. But if you look, you can see that we are the second lowest in terms of mass opinion. Only Austria is less supportive than we are. And we are, in terms of the elite opinion, we are the least supportive of all the countries. You'll also see, if you look at all the other bars, that in most countries, the elites are much more pro-European than the masses. And this is a very, very familiar bit of the story about support for the European Union. It's always been an elite-driven project. It's always been the elites that have been pushing forward. They've wanted much more European unification than the masses in their respective countries. But as far as Britain is concerned, we are the least supportive overall. If we then go to the next slide, this is just on European identity, which is another dimension of support. Again, if you look to the middle, you can see that Britain is the one that's lowest. It's lower than everybody else. Everything's a lot lower in terms of identity, but nonetheless, it's Britain that's the lowest. So at both mass and elite levels, in essence, Britain is the most Eurosceptic. So what this slide does is just to summarize for you what we've said so far in terms of these graphs. We've always been more Eurosceptic than the rest. That first graph, the European line, being much higher than the British line. Elites are more pro-European across Europe than the masses are. We are by far the lowest in terms of strengthening the European Union, both at mass and elite level, more or less, and we certainly are on European identity. We are distinctively Eurosceptic. That's really what all of this information has been about trying to demonstrate. Now, I want to go on to the third question now, which again I'm going to throw a lot of graphs at you. I'm going to throw them at you quite quickly. You don't need to notice the particular numbers, but I hope you can recognize what's going on in terms of the shape of things and get a particular shape in your minds, because that shape matters, as you'll see. And then we're going to bring the story forward a bit more towards the present day. As part of the British election study that I worked on with Paul Whiteley and Harold Clark and Marianne Stewart, we produced a series of books together and articles on movements in opinion in Britain over the period from the late 1990s. And we did something called the Continuous Monitoring Survey. Now, that Continuous Monitoring Survey gave us a survey every month which enabled us to track public opinion in Britain in a way that had really never been done before in the level of detail and depth that we were able to do. And we included quite a lot of questions about the European Union. And what I'm going to show you here is how we can break down the pattern of support for the European Union in Britain, not just by looking at the overall level of support, but we can look at support among different groups. And you can start to see some differentiation in the story, which is actually, I would think it's interesting. You might not be quite so convinced, but I think there are some interesting features of it. And what you see is that the groups basically vary according to whether they've got resources or not. It's not always quite like this, but generally speaking, groups that are better off tend to be more supportive of the European Union. There are two exceptions that I'll come to, but generally speaking, it's this pattern of if you've got resources, then you're more likely to be supportive of the European Union. The reason for that is simple. It's the groups with resources that have done better out of the European Union than the groups that haven't got resources, and that's why you get these differentiations. The second thing that you'll notice, and this is the penultimate point on the slide, is that all the groups move together. And again, this is very important. This is not something that you find men behaving one way and women behaving completely differently. All of the movement over time happens across all of the groups. I'll show you this in a minute with the slides. And then the final point, and this goes back to my concern about the referendum and my concern about the risks of referendum, is that there are external shocks that seem to drive the movements in opinion. And you'll see this as we move through. Now, here's the graph. We looked in the long-term graph, ran from 1952 up to 2008. That was the work that Chris Anderson had done, and it stopped there. This is now bringing it with this continuous monitoring survey, the work with Paul Whiteley, that starts in 2004 and comes through to the end of 2013. Fortunately, I couldn't get the data any more recently than that. But what you see happening is that decline and recovery pattern. It's very, very clear. And those of you that have thought about this or are probably thinking about it now will realize what's driving that decline and that recovery. It's the euro crisis. The crisis of firstly, the banking crisis from 2008, and then the euro crisis that followed very hard on its heels and became part of it, the sovereign debt crisis as it became, all of that produced a decline in support for the European Union. It did this across the European Union. This was not exclusively a British phenomenon. It happened everywhere. But it's very clear the pattern that occurs here. But then once the crisis has started to dissipate a bit, you start to see the recovery occurring again. So remember that pattern, and that's why it says the bit in yellow at the bottom, watch the pattern. Because what we're going to do now is go through the different groups and see what it looks like with the different groups. Do it by gender. You get exactly the same pattern when you look at men and women. You get that same decline recovery. But note the difference in the levels. Men are more supportive of the European Union than women are. Women are more cynical. Women are more Eurosceptic, if you like, because they're less supportive. They're less convinced. Here's where the resources come in. It's generally, obviously, there are lots of exceptions, but generally speaking, it's the men that have the resources or have proportionately more resources than women. And so it's the people who are benefiting most from the European Union who are more supportive. But the key thing is the decline recovery. If we go on to age, I'll leave this on for a bit longer because there's something really important here about age. I hope you can see the green line at the top. I know they weren't always too easy to see. Can you see the green line at the top? Yeah, thank you. Good. Okay, what this one shows is different age cohorts. The green line are the young folk. They are the people who were born after 1972, after we went into the European Union, the European Community as it was then. The middle line are the people who were born between 1946 and 1973, in other words, after the war, but before we went into the European Union. And then the blue line is the people who were born before 1946. And what you see there, obviously, are very clear differences in levels. The older you are, the less likely you are to be supportive of the European Union. But regardless of that, all of the groups move together. The movement in opinion is the same over time, regardless of age cohort. So it's the same external influence that's driving the changes in the pattern of support. Why do I say this graph is so important? Just think about what that top line, that green line means. These are the young folk. Look at their levels of support for the European Union. This is pretty high. It starts at 65, it goes up above 70, it drops down to about 55, and it's back up to above 60 now. These people are the future. If we have a referendum and we decide to leave the European Union, these people are the ones who are going to live with the decision, and they want to stay in. Now, I simply offer you that as a thought, as a problem for the Eurosceptic position. And don't think I'm being biased, because I'm going to make lots of points that criticise the non-Eurosceptic position, the Europhile position. I'll be making criticism of that too. But this is a real issue as far as a possible referendum is concerned. Anyway, we've got the pattern. Then we look at ethnicity. Now, this is the first example where the resources argument doesn't work. It's the people who don't have resources here who are more supportive. Clearly, ethnic minority voters, respondents, presumably see more of a protection, more opportunity in the European Union, and they are consistently more supportive than the white population. But again, the key thing is the pattern. You see that decline and recovery occurring again, regardless of characteristic. If we go on to class, you get the same thing. The middle class are more supportive. They do better. They get the good jobs that result from membership of the European Union. They get the chance to travel more and enjoy the pleasures of having homes overseas and whatever else. The working class are the ones who suffer more and are therefore less supportive, less resources. But again, the pattern's the same. The movement over time is exactly the same. If we look at region, we see the other exception. It's the periphery, it's Scotland and Wales, where there is stronger support for the European Union than there is in England. And again, the reason of that is pretty obvious. The Scots see a kind of protection in the European Union from some of the depredations that they consider that London imposes on them, and exactly the same with the Welsh. I've had to put them together because of the number of cases in these various surveys over time. But again, the key thing is the pattern. You get exactly the same over time pattern of support. Here, the graphs don't look quite so marked, but that's because the scale's been spread. You've still got the same sort of movement in the pattern, but it's done by party identification here. Nothing surprising here. You've got Liberal Democrats and Labour at the top with very high levels of support for the European Union, which is what you'd expect. You've got the Conservatives bobbling about in the middle with not very high levels, and you've got a few UKIP loonies who are non-zero bobbling along the bottom. who probably don't really know what they're responding to. I wouldn't take that purple line too seriously, and I'm not being rude about UKIP. That's not my intention. Okay, so party identification, you get a pattern that you'd more or less expect when people associate with the party. It tends to affect the way that they think about the European Union. This slide is purely for my colleagues in the Department of Government who might be concerned that I haven't done some serious statistical analysis of all this. I don't intend to talk about it. If they want to talk to me about it afterwards, but this is, as it says at the top, an ordered logit model of all of those effects that you've been looking at before, plus a few more that I can justify throwing in related to financial pessimism and related to attitudes towards immigration. And that shows that all of these effects hold most of the time, even when you put them in what's called a multivariate statistical model. So these aren't just effects that we're observing, not controlling for relevant factors. So when we're simultaneously considering all these things together, they're all having effects, they're all having measurable effects and consistent effects over time. Now, I've got now to where I wanted to be really, which I hope you'll find the most interesting part of the lecture. That's all background, but you kind of need it at the back of your heads to understand just how reluctant we are and how there is differentiation in our reluctance, but nonetheless it all moves together over time. When I try to answer the question, why, I can't help but think in terms of stories. I think probably in general that's the way I think about explanations of when you're trying to understand why people do things, think things, say things. I'm thinking about the stories they tell themselves and the stories that they tell each other in order to understand what's going on in the world. And it's those stories that they tell themselves that I think provide us the clue to understanding the answer to the question why, that give us the explanations. So I'm going to offer you 7 sets of stories, 7 sets of explanations, if you like. I did try to think of a mnemonic, but I could only come up with very rude words when I thought of a mnemonic, so I abandoned it. It began with F, and that was part of the problem. This is where the evidence comes in. And as I say, when I did the initial draft of this lecture, I was making a lot of these points without any evidence. And then thanks to this survey from YouGov, I've now got the evidence that I need in most of the time to be able to, I think, to sustain these arguments. But you can judge for yourself. Okay, here I've got no evidence. This first point, I've got no evidence other than all of the textbooks on British foreign policy that have been written for the last 100 years. This is an elite level explanation, an elite level understanding. It's about the way the British elite has thought about foreign policy for at least 100 years, possibly for 200 years. This role conception, what role does Britain play on the international stage? And the role conception, the characterization of that role conception has typically always been that Britain was, in the 19th century, classically, a balancer of power. We always looked for where there was a growing preponderance of power in Europe, and we would always side with the other side. We'd always try consciously to balance power. That was what we did. We had no permanent allies, no permanent enemies. We were always interested in protecting the empire, protecting our own interests by preventing the emergence of preponderant power elsewhere. Now, that idea after the Second World War kind of transmuted into this very famous phrase that Churchill used, his 3 circles, Britain's 3 circles of influence, in the empire, in the special relationship with the United States, and in Europe. Now, over time, as we decolonized, obviously the empire circle, the Commonwealth circle as it became less and less important. But somehow we've kind of never really lost that hope of having the special relationship with the United States, even though the United States don't think it's very special these days. Nonetheless, we tend to think we have that relationship. We still have those pretensions to punch above our weight in global affairs. We still want to hang on to our permanent seat on the Security Council of the United Nations. All of these things are a kind of overhang of this imperial circle, of the empire circle. And I think a lot of analysts would argue, and I would certainly argue, that imperial overhang, that somehow that sense that we ought to have a bigger role in Europe, in the world, than perhaps our European status implies, has always made it difficult for us properly to embrace Europe. Now, I can't provide you with detailed empirical evidence to support that. other than the evidence of a survey that, with some work that I did with Helen Wallace, who will be speaking later, and a colleague, Graham Hall, who may be here. I'm not sure whether Graham's here. He said he might come. We did some work about 20 years ago where we did a survey of the British foreign policy elite, and we certainly found attitudes that were consistent with that kind of characterization. The point is that it renders this commitment to the Empire Circle and the special relationship renders a genuine European commitment very difficult. Here's where we get on to the second explanation. And the second explanation is about economics, and it comes in three parts. And the graph that you see there is a long-term plot that begins in 1900 on the left-hand side. So this is a very long-term graph. And it runs through to nearly 2010 on the bottom. And what it shows you is the percentage of British exports that go to Europe, and then latterly the red line that go to the European Union. And you can see that there is this very long-term swing in our trade pattern. There was a decline from 1900 through to about 1950, just a progressive decline in the proportion of exports that we were sending to Europe. But after about 1950, it starts to swing upwards. And after 1960, it's swinging upwards quite rapidly. Now, please note that, again, this is part of the story of why we wanted to join the European Union in the first place. In the mid-1960s, remember, we had two applications, 1961-62 and then 1967, when we tried to join the European Economic Community, and de Gaulle kept vetoing us, and de Gaulle wouldn't have us in to the European Union. The reason we wanted to join was because our trade was increasing with the European Union, and we could see the advantage of more trade, of increasing our trade, of reducing the barriers which membership of that economic club would imply. Now, it carries on going up. And that all looks fine, and when you hear Europhiles talking about how important trade with Europe is, they're right, it is very important. But here's another graph. And here, if you're a Eurosceptic, you'll like this graph. Because one of the problems of the British economy at the moment is that we do have a very large balance of payments deficit. Now, you can find economists who will tell you a balance of payments deficit doesn't matter, but you will also find economists who tell you that it does matter. And what this graph shows you is the size of the deficit, the balance of payments deficit with the European Union as a proportion of all of our exports. So how much of our export deficit is due to trade with the European Union? That's what it's telling you. And this, again, is a very long-term graph. It goes from 1900 right up to 2010. And if you look here, I'll try and just highlight that line there is the zero line. So there is only one very brief period of time in the 1950s when we actually went above the zero line, when we were actually exporting more to Europe than they were exporting to us. All the rest of the time we have a deficit in our trade with Europe. Now it goes down, and then things from about 1990 start to improve really quite remarkably. I've checked these numbers, although I've only got limited data points here. I have checked that these trends really exist, and they really are there. And then from around 2000, the sort of early Blair period, it starts tailing off again. So what we've got now is a position where 25% of our deficit our deficit with the European Union is 25% of our total export value. This is a huge, huge problem. The simple shorthand of it is they get much more out of trading with us than we get out of trading with them. That's one way of characterizing it. And it's something that I think fans of the European Union need to consider. I missed one. Okay, so we're still on economics, and this is now the second element of economics. And this second element of economics relates to the net contribution that we make. All of the furore that occurred a couple of weeks ago with the 1.7 billion euro extra payment that we got to make by way of contribution. There are some numbers from 2012 that you can see for yourself. When you look at those numbers on the left-hand side, it's pretty clear that we don't have to pay a huge amount to Europe in comparison with the other large European countries. Our contribution, because we get the rebate that Margaret Thatcher negotiated in the 1980s, we don't have to pay a huge amount of contribution to the European Union. And for that, we get back quite a lot. And this is really the important point, because what the right-hand side tries to do is to list the things that we get back. Now, the immediate things that we get back are the direct payments. You can see that we get direct payments for transport, for roads, road programs in the northwest of Britain, in northwest of England, in Scotland, lots of road programs. We get research that sometimes comes to universities, I'm pleased to say. We get environmental funds, we get some subsidies for agriculture. There's other things that we get as well, but those are the main things that we get back directly. But in addition to those direct things which come out of this figure, this 20 billion, that comes out of that, in addition to that, we get lots of indirect benefits. And in particular, we get a bigger demand for UK products than we get if we weren't members of the European Union. We get a lot of foreign direct investment, both from the European Union and from outside the European Union. And then we get various multiplier effects that follow on from that. And we similarly get advantage in trade negotiations of being part of a bigger bloc. Now, the thing in red in the bottom right-hand corner is the single best hidden secret in the UK in the debate about our place in Europe. That figure is hardly ever quoted. Now, the CBI put health warnings on it. They say, look, we've derived this figure from an analysis of all of the secondary analysis of all the work that's been done on the European Union. But I'm inclined to believe it. And if you believe that that figure is even approximately correct, then what it suggests is that our membership of the European Union is bringing in something like 70 billion pounds, not euros, per year to the British economy that we wouldn't get if we weren't members. Now, this is a real challenge to economists, and my own challenge to our economists here is let's do some serious work on this, because I think this is terribly important to know exactly what this figure is. It's very hard to estimate, but I think the task is so important that we ought to do it. When you compare the budget contribution with the indirect benefit, then this is something that really needs to be taken into account in the debate. And that figure needs bandying about a lot more than it is. The third element of the economics is the fact that there's just this general sense that actually the Europeans don't know what they're doing. And I've got to say, I can bore for England on this, and I really will be very, very brief. But this is all based on an idea that I first understood by talking to David Mackay, who is here somewhere, about this more than 15 years ago, when the single currency was on the cards. David made the point very strongly that if you want to run a currency union, a currency area, you've got to have at least 20% of the resources under the control of the central state in order to be able to make the transfer payments to areas of the economy that aren't working very well. So in Britain, for example, we can make transfers to the northeast of England when it wasn't doing very well, or Scotland when it wasn't doing very well, because the British state controls, well, now about 40% of GDP. David's point was that the European Union could never work as a single currency area because it only controlled, well, at that point, under 3% of GDP. If the central authorities only control 3% of GDP, they haven't got the wherewithal to be able to make the transfers to other parts of the Union if the economy isn't working in those parts in order to make them work. And there isn't the political will anyway for them to have a massive increase in that central capability. So there's always been a problem with the euro. They were warned when they went forward with the project, but it was a political decision to go through with the euro, not an economic decision. They pretended that they knew what would happen when the euro was created, and they didn't know what would happen. And I think that an awful lot of the problems of southern Europe at the moment are precisely to be held at the door of the euro. Maybe we can talk about that in the questions if you want. But here's where the first bit of evidence came in, because I was convinced that people thought that the euro was a bad idea, but I couldn't really see an awful lot of evidence to support it. So I got YouGov in this survey to ask the question, the EU's insistence on keeping the euro is the main cause of the economic difficulties experienced by these southern European countries. Now, I've excluded the don't knows from all these numbers, and clearly you get a slightly different story if you include the don't knows, but I wanted to, for for this audience, for you, I wanted to make it clear rather than make all the qualifications that I'd have to make if I were giving an academic presentation. And what you see there is that 70% of the people who answered this question, and this was a representative sample of the British public, 70% basically agree with that prospect. And then if you look inside the agrees, the people who agree with that, in other words, the people who think that the euro is a problem, then you find this pattern of approving of the EU, 23%, and disapproving 77%. Now, this may seem, oh God, statistics, I don't want to do that, but actually this is important, because if you want to understand why people think the things that they do, then you've got to look for relationships, you've got to look for patterns. And this is a pattern, this is a really important pattern. It's saying that if you're critical of the euro, if you think that the euro is in large part responsible for these problems that the Southern Zone countries are experiencing, then you are much more likely, you are 3 times more likely to be opposed to the European Union than approve of it. And that's the kind of relationship that we're looking for when we try to engage in this little bit of science, this little bit of political science that we're trying to do in order to evaluate these theoretical claims. So, as it says in blue at the bottom, look at the pattern, not the numbers. The disapproval of the EU is linked to beliefs, and it's these beliefs, these stories, that I'm trying to get at. So if we now move on to the third explanation, what I've described as constitutional disempowerment, here you're all familiar with the cry, "We never signed up for this." And I think there are 3 areas where people feel disempowered as a result of the European Union. I'm going to whiz through them pretty quickly. You can see them at the bottom there. One is about the executive, one is about the legislative, and one is about the judiciary. And you can see them there. We'll just expand on them a little bit with a bit of evidence. So the first one, this idea of legislative, sorry, it's missed one out, executive confusion. The first problem is there's no clarity of responsibility. And so I asked this group of people, in the European Union, it's impossible to tell who is in charge. You find a very large proportion of people agreeing with that. And then again, of the ones that do agree with it, you can see it's this 25-75 split again that disapprove of the European Union. So if you believe that statement, then you're very likely to disapprove of the European Union. And as we cycle through, and I'll do it quite quickly because the numbers don't matter, it's the pattern. If we move on to the legislature, here I was trying to get at the idea that we lost parliamentary sovereignty in 1973. What replaced it? Do people have any sense that anything's replaced it? And I tried to get at that by this particular statement here. In the EU, most voters can't vote out decision makers they don't like, can't hold the executive to the legislature to account. And again, you get that same pattern, a large proportion of people agreeing, and then among the agrees, there's this overwhelming preponderance of disapproval of the EU. So what we're finding is that these attitudes towards the EU, these beliefs about the EU, are driving whether you approve or disapprove of it. And then finally, on the judicial dimension, this idea of under the European Union, basically law has been rather more important, courts have been more important in terms of interpreting the Constitution. That was always the European tradition anyway, than historically they were in Britain. What we find if we looked at Britain in the 1970s, actually judicialisation here was growing anyway. It would probably have grown more, but inside the EU, it seems to have, at least in the popular opinion, in the popular imagination, seems to be more important. And again, the quotation here, where I gave them the statement, with Britain inside the EU, decisions made by judges have more influence than changes in laws passed by Parliament. And again, you can see this same pattern, a high level of agreement, and then among those who agree, this disapproval rating of 86% disapproving of the EU. So clearly what's happening is that people who feel disempowered by the EU are the people who disapprove of it. And that I think is an important part of the story. This is one that I do want to impress on you, because it's one where people make a factual error, which I've called it the mistake over the European Court of Human Rights. And the key here is that people think that the European Court of Human Rights is an EU institution, when it isn't. It's not an official EU institution at all, but people believe it is. And they don't like the judgments it makes because it contradicts their authoritarian instincts, and they therefore blame it on the European Union, when it's not the European Union's fault. So you actually have a complete misunderstanding of an institution, of its nature, and of the kind of rulings that it's making. And what that's producing is the same pattern where 91% of people, and if you include the don't knows, it's 71% of people. So 7 people in 10 in Britain believe that first statement. And this is really quite extraordinary. They think that it's a European Union institution, and it's not. And yet it then feeds through into negative views of the European Union itself when you come down to the people who agree with it. Okay, the fifth one is the one you know all about, so I'll go over this quite quickly. Immigration. The mainstream politicians can't even bear to call it immigration, they call it net migration, which I think is preposterous, since net migration could be net migration outwards. And the problem here is that all the opinion poll evidence for the last 40 years, when people have been asked what's the most important issue facing the country, when it's not been the economy or some short-term crisis, the thing that people have identified year after year after year is immigration. And politicians just ignored it. They were scared. You can understand why they were scared. They were scared of accusations of racism, and so they just didn't address it. And what that meant is that in the absence of mainstream politicians start talking about it, it left the territory free for less desirable groups to talk about it. Now, the immigration from Eastern Europe since 2000 has obviously created the possibility of talking about immigration without appearing racist, because these are people of the same ethnicity as the dominant ethnicity here. And so now you've had UKIP, as it says there, cleaning up basically, because they've been able to articulate a concern that other politicians have not been prepared to address properly. Now, obviously, it's on the general agenda now, and as I'm sure you'll have picked up from lots of debate that's going on in the media, there's a sense that there may be a way out of this impasse. And I was trying to get here with this question that you see in red there. Immigrants to the UK should not be entitled to any social welfare until they have paid income tax and national insurance contributions for at least 2 years. You might think that's rather a harsh statement. It is rather a harsh statement. But you find a very, very high level of agreement with that statement. And I see that as one of the solutions, or one of the ways of taking the heat out of this whole immigration debate, without needing to address this labour mobility question inside the EU, which I think our European partners won't have much sympathy for. This may be the way in which we can start to approach the immigration difficulties that we have. Penultimate explanation is about the relative efficiency of the British state, which is really captured, as you see there, in the question that we put to the YouGov respondents. British administrators and public servants implement EU rules more strictly and rigorously than their counterparts in other European Union countries. Look at the levels of agreement there. 82% of people believe that. And then again, it's the same pattern at the bottom. Among those who believe it, more than 2/3, 69%, are saying, yeah, we disapprove of the EU. So all of these things are feeding into this resentment of the EU, of this rejection of the European Union. And I think they're very important stories that people tell themselves. You'll be pleased to know we're getting towards the end. The final one is inconsistent parties. And what I really mean here is mainstream parties, Liberal Democrats accepted, who have failed to provide consistent messages to make the case for the European Union. And if any of you want to read about this and get the proper documentation on all this, I suggest you look at a book by our Vice-Chancellor on Euroscepticism, which he published in 2002, which is an excellent justification of that last slide, and I will say no more about that, because I want to move on to try and conclude within the time I've got available. So, what are we saying? I'm saying that the British are reluctant. They're reluctant at both the mass and the elite levels, and I've tried to provide you with evidence to show that that's the case. Britons with resources are more pro-EU, except for in relation to ethnicity and in relation to Scotland and Wales. But their support moves together over time. Support fell with the euro crisis and it's recovered since. And then if you're looking for the key sources, the 4 things that I would identify, if you're wanting a summary to take away of what I've been trying to tell you, what are the 4 key causes of British Euroscepticism in the short term? And by the short term, I mean the period since 2000, actually, because I think that's when it started, when the euro was introduced, is the euro. They don't know what they're doing. They pretend, the European elite pretends it knows what it's doing, and it doesn't. And it has screwed up the southern zone economies no end, and I don't see any way, while they maintain the euro, of ever restoring the southern zone economies. I spent a lot of time in Italy, and it's a disaster zone. The second is this concern about we don't get as much out of the trade deal as they do. They benefit more. They're exporting more to us than we are to them. Actually, they need us more than we need them. Third, the constitutional disempowerment. The fact that we don't know who the rascals are, we can't get the rascals out, we can't vote them out, and then there's all this judicial stuff coming that probably would have come anyway, but nonetheless the EU gets blamed for it. And then finally, immigration and the way that it's been ignored by mainstream parties and exploited very cleverly by UKIP. Challenge for the Eurosceptics is the one at the bottom. It's the one relating to this huge economic cost that we would incur if we withdrew. And I want to finish with a slide that offers a challenge to you if you're a Eurosceptic. Look down the left-hand side, and if you're a Europhile, look down the right-hand side. There are no easy answers in any of this. I'm not suggesting anything is easy or clearly established. There are problems whichever way you want to look at the world, but here are the key problems. If you're a Eurosceptic, how do you handle the fact that the young folk are massively supportive of the European Union? How can you square your determination to leave the European Union when it's their future you're messing about with and they want to stay in? Secondly, free movement is beneficial to us too. Okay, people complain about people coming here, but we go there too. 1.4 million Britons live and work abroad in the European Union and their families. Immigration could be handled if we think about this change to a contributory scheme. That might be the way of taking the heat out of immigration, so it wouldn't be the problem that Eurosceptics think it is. And then finally, the point again about the indirect financial contribution. If you're a Europhile, you've got to deal with this. The euro is a disaster. How do you deal with a political elite in Europe that doesn't know what it's doing? I'm absolutely convinced they don't know what they're doing. And the worst thing is they pretend that they do. Secondly, you've got this issue of UK trade and the deficit, which is a real significant cost to Britain. All those things about disempowerment that you see in the middle. The same point about immigration, though there may be a solution to it. And then the point about this mistake, the penultimate point, mistake about the European Court. They blame the decisions of the European Court on the European Union because they don't like the decisions it's making, some of the decisions it's making, and they blame it on the European Union. And then the final point that I made right at the beginning, all of this means, all of that evidence about movements in mass opinion mean that a referendum is really risky. And it bothers me that we might be moving towards one without fully appreciating what it might imply. Thank you very much.